Fundamentally, every single relationship that you come across is based on that simple foundation, trust.
If you want to succeed in business, if you want to succeed in the family, if you want to succeed in any kind of relationship among partners, trust is the starting point of your personal success.
Nobody wants to buy products or services from the company that do not keep their promises or meet their expectations.
If I don't trust someone, I can't work with them. If I don't trust a company, I won't buy its products or services.
Mistrust is what can disrupt, it can virtually destroy not only families, but also societies, nations, and markets.
Without trust, you can't make friends. Without trust, you don't enjoy your work. Without trust, you don't have any fulfilling life.
One has to also look at trust in this instance, and perhaps in the broader context of this conversation, in also the context of how you would define a leader.
Only when a trust basis has been established, people, our customers, will open up with their wishes, will move away from their comfort zone and tell us what they really long for.
Trusted companies find it easier to maintain a good customer relationship, win new business, and attract the best talents.
Trust is a critical component, I think, of any brand. It's about a relationship that you build between the brand and between your consumer, your customer, between government.
It's not a project, it's not a tactic, and it's not a one-off activity. It starts in the boardroom and it ends with your marketing activities. It's within your product, it's within the products you sell, it's within the platforms that you promote your products, and it's how ethical you are as a business.
The most important thing for me about trust is that it drives behaviour, purely and simply.
Trust is by nature fleeting. That means we must prove again and again that we deserve it, that we deserve that our customers or other stakeholders have trust in us.
皆様、本日はお忙しい中ご来場いただきまして誠にありがとうございます。ただいまよりエデルマンジャパン株式会社主催、株式会社グロービス協力の特別セミナー、信頼とアベノミクストラストバロメーターから見た審判を始めさせていただきます。私、本日司会を務めさせていただきますエデルマンジャパンの大野と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。本日のセミナーは同時通訳を入れさせていただいております。お手元のレシーバーで日本語はチャンネル1、英語はチャンネル2に設定いただきますようお願い申し上げます。なお、本セミナーの様子はウェブサイトグロービス TV にて動画配信をしております。後日、同サイトにアーカイブ映像を掲載させていただきますので、ご了承くださいますようお願い申し上げます。また、本日のイベントは、ハッシュタグエデルトラストにて、ライブツイートでも発信しておりますので、こちらでもぜひご参加いただけますと幸いでございます。皆様にお渡ししました資料の中に、本日のプレゼン資料も含まれておりますので、細かいデータ等はお手元の資料にてご確認くださいますようお願い申し上げます。私どもエデルマンでは、毎年エデルマントラストバロメーターという政府、企業、NGO、メディアに対する信頼度調査を行っており、今年で14年目となります。今回の調査は昨年10月から11月にかけて、世界27カ国3万3000人を対象に実施されました。グローバルの調査結果は1月22日にスイスで開催されましたダボス会議にて発表させていただきました。本セミナーでは日本の調査結果を発表させていただきます。本日はまずエデルマンの親会社であります DJE ホールディングスのバイスチェアマンアラン・バンダーモーレンより2014エデルマントラストバロメーターの調査結果を発表させていただきます。次にパネリストの皆様をお迎えし、信頼とアベノミクスをテーマに会場の皆様からの質問を受けながらパネルディスカッションを行ってまいります。それでは早速ですが講演に移らせていただきます。アラン、よろしくお願いいたします。
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for hosting us. I'd like to thank Hori-san for hosting us tonight at Globus again, good friend of the firm, and I think a great voice for Japan, both domestically and overseas. I'd also like to thank our distinguished panelists ahead of time. I think we've got an all-star lineup tonight, so thanks. And hopefully we'll provoke some thought. Two things before I get started. The first thing is that our translators, our interpreters in the back doing simultaneous translation are going to have a test to see if they can stay up with me tonight. So we're going to test them a little bit. There's a bonus if they can keep pace with me. And the second thing is I just noticed the slides are in English. Wow, okay. Because they were in Japanese initially, so I can relax. Look, we just saw a video on trust, and as I was listening to that video, it's the first time I've seen it, which is probably not good. But as I was listening, we kept talking about trust, trust, trust. And I think it's important that maybe I start with a definition tonight. And we started to do this study 14 years ago when we saw the collapse of Enron and we saw the collapse of Arthur Andersen. And we felt in the United States certainly that there was a real crisis of trust in business. But we didn't really define it. We just looked at it as a notion. And I think after we've started to move a little bit, we've heard conversations in business talking about managing reputation as an asset. And we hear a lot of discussions of businesses trying to put a price tag on reputation as an asset. And I actually think that if business is managing reputation as an asset, they're managing the wrong asset. Because reputation is like driving a car forward but looking in the rearview mirror the entire time. Because reputation is the sum of perceptions of past behavior. It's things that happened in the past. And trust is an expression of how stakeholders believe you'll behave in the future. So if an investor trusts your business, they're going to put money in. And if a potential employee trusts you, believes you're going to provide training, believes you're going to compensate them fairly, believes you're going to give them competitive health care in countries that don't have it, like mine, they will, Obamacare notwithstanding. We could talk about that over beers later, speaking of trust. Anyway, if employees trust you, they're going to come to work for you and they're going to stay employed with you. If a customer or consumer trusts you, they're going to buy your product and service. They're going to pay a fair price for that because not only do they believe it's a high quality product, but they also believe if that product fails or has a breakdown, that the company is going to be there to support it. So trust is an expression of how stakeholders believe you're going to behave in the future. So I have a fundamental belief that the proper asset for governments and for businesses and for other institutions to manage is actually trust, because it's forward-looking, not reputation. And I think Japan's in an interesting crossroads, and we'll talk about the data, and our panelists will go much deeper in Japanese. But I think Japan has an interesting opportunity here. Because as you'll see in our study tonight, Japan's kind of bucking the global trend. Trust in government in Japan is on the way up. The trust gap between business and government in Japan is narrowing. I think Japan has an interesting opportunity given the reforms that are happening here, given the economic growth, given some of the stock market performance. There's an interesting opportunity to start to forge a forward-looking narrative about this country and about the trade opportunities overseas, about Japanese companies investing in markets overseas, about starting to tell a success story about Japan that's a real-time narrative instead of justifying the last 30 years of, a very difficult economic performance and coming off of 3/11, some difficult times. And I think you can start to frame your narrative now a little bit differently, looking forward and looking to manage trust as an asset instead of explaining reputation and reputational issues which are historical. So with that, I'm going to have to improvise. It's okay, don't worry, don't just hit the button. Oh, it is? Thank you, great. So I'm the one being tested tonight. So with that, let's take a look at our, now you're playing tricks with me. Let's take a look at our results. So we'll start with just a brief message. I got it, don't worry. a brief message on methodology, which is this is the 14th year we've done this study, and we have two samples. We have an opinion leader sample, which is really what I'm going to focus on tonight, which is top 25% of income, university educated, and people say that they consume media, and a significant media on a regular basis, in particular media about business and media about public affairs and policy. We also do a general population sample, which I'm not going to focus on tonight, but I'll bring it in a couple times just to draw some points of comparison. But mainly I'm going to focus on opinion leaders tonight because I think that reflects the audience this evening. We've branded this study, we've tried to pick out main themes of the study over time. We started 14 years ago on the bottom of the chart here with the rising influence of NGOs as a reaction to the decreased trust in business in the United States in particular. I think now we've seen the evolution now to where business is actually rebounded nicely, and you'll see that in our data in a minute, to where business has the opportunity to start to take a lead on discussions around policy, on discussions around economic stimulus and economic issues, as well as social issues and a social agenda. That business now is pretty well positioned to start to participate, if not drive dialogue in these areas. Now let's take a look at the state of trust and get into our data. So I'm going to start you with some global data. So the most trusted institution of the four institutions we measure, NGOs, business, media, and government, most trusted institution globally, NGOs. And it continues to be the most trusted. I think this is the fourth or fifth year in a row that it's been the most trusted institution globally at 64%. And the percentage point you see on all these slides are top four boxes on a 1 to 9 scale. So that's the percentage of our respondents that say they trust NGOs 6, 7, 8, or 9 on a scale of 1 to 9. The dark blue on the bottom is the percent of those respondents that trust the institution, top 2 boxes, an 8 or a 9. So a high degree of trust or high intensity level of trust. So globally, NGOs 1, followed by business, media in third, government bringing up the rear. Government has really been hit hard globally, skewed dramatically by figures in the United States and figures in Western Europe, primarily around inability to reach agreements on budgets and ongoing debate about what to do in the European Union in the case of Western Europe. Japan, however, as with two other parts of our survey, kind of bucks this trend. And when you look at the Japan-informed public results, what you see is business most trusted at 53%, followed by government. And trust in government in Japan is up 13 percentage points versus last year, the biggest mover in our study globally. Big move up for trust in government domestically. Trust in media is on the decline here in terms of opinion elites, and trust in NGOs. NGOs the least trusted institution here. Now, a word on NGOs. In Western Europe and the United States, NGOs are generally seen as being productive participants in policy discussion and playing more or less a watchdog role, in particular as it relates to environmental issues, access to health, and access to education. In this part of the world, and also in a lot of emerging markets, NGOs are generally seen as foreign influences that come into a market and do a lot of what I call finger wagging. In particular here, you guys get hit a little bit on the whale trade and Greenpeace having some pretty aggressive tactics. So I think that tars all NGOs with that kind of reputation. I think the other thing that you see happen in NGOs in Japan is the NGOs that got involved in post-3/11 recovery have not been transparent with what they did with their funds and how those funds were applied. So I think there's some transparency and some governance issues here as it relates to the local or community-based NGOs. The next thing we do in this study, and this is back to Japan data, I believe. This is all countries. So what we do here is we take a look at a trust index. So we take the levels of trust in each institution by country, add them together, and divide by 4. And that generally helps us see the most trusting nations versus the least trusting nations in their institutions. And this is movement, again, from the informed publics or opinion leaders over the last 12 months. What you see here, global trust index moving down, so from 57% to 54%, driven by a real collapse in trust in government. And you can see the markets to the left with Japan being in net distruster territory overall. However, when you look at those scores relative, it's not such a bad story because you're moving back up from your 2012 lows, which reflected what happened post March 11th. We also see here, I just do a quick comparison. This is one of the places where I'll bring up the general public data is, in general, we have the general population sample less trusting than opinion leaders. And that's true in every market we look at because the general population tends to be a step away from government, a step further than opinion leaders, a step further away from business, therefore has less familiarity and potentially less context for the actions of business and government. And they also have probably a different read on media reportage on what's happening in the market. So you can see decidedly less trusting general population than opinion leaders, which is pretty typical. And in Japan, you see that on the bottom left, 44% for your opinion leaders to 40% for your general population, which is getting into pretty dangerously low territory there in terms of net distruster. The next thing we look at here is some of our longitudinal data back to informed publics, and I'll stick with informed publics now so I won't point that sample out further. You see longitudinal data for Japan. And what you would see here is I just call your attention to 2011, so that's pre-March 11, and then look at the big drop you had in 2012. In particular, looking at trust in government bottoming out there at 25%. So that's 25% of our respondents gave government 6, 7, 8, or 9 on a scale of 1 to 9 in terms of trust. What you see now, if we jump forward to 2014, is what I would call a really nice recovery for government. I think driven by, one, a change in government, and two, good performance in the capital markets here, and better than expected performance economically in terms of your growth figures. I would also call your attention to a trend that's counter the rest of the globe, which is a narrowing of the gap between trust in business and trust in government. And this is one of the themes for the evening as I look at Japan, where I think there's an opportunity for business and government to start to craft a new narrative that's a forward-looking narrative for the country based upon a reform agenda, based upon the performance of Japanese businesses overseas, and based upon, I believe, what is better than expected economic news. So I think there's a real opportunity there to start to craft a new forward-looking narrative that is based upon managing trusted relationships to help drive a national agenda forward versus discussing historical reputational issues as a reason why we continue to have kind of a stop-and-start performance. The next thing, I want to talk about here is just compare Japan to the rest of the world in terms of what's happening with trust in government. So in 17 of the 26 countries we measure globally, we either saw trust in government flat or we saw a decline in trust in government. In Japan, we had a big move up from 32% to 45%, and you see the other markets that have moved up with you, the UAE, which is based on economic performance. Australia, we usually see a jump in trust in government with a change in administration or a change in leadership, which is what we had in Australia. And you can see the other markets across the bottom where trust in government has actually moved up. Now let's go back to Japan for a second. While you have had, so the top right quadrant here on the slide I'm going to look at, while you have had a nice 13 percentage point jump in trust in government, I will call your attention to what I call very weak intensity in that trust. So only 8% of our opinion leaders sample said that they trust government a great deal, 8 or 9 on a scale of 1 to 9, which means there is very little margin for error with this government. We feel generally pretty good about the economy. We feel generally pretty good about the reforms. There are still some issues lurking out here, and our opinion leaders are saying we're watching very closely. So we're optimistic, yet we are very cautiously optimistic if you look at that intensity score. So that's something, if I'm sitting in the current administration, I'm paying very close attention to. Because I've got a little mandate for action now, but not a lot of mandate for perceived errors. Now, if we look at trust in media, again, globally, you can see what's happening here. Trust in media is flat to down in 21 countries. It's high in only 5 of the countries we measure. And in Japan, trust in media is in net distruster territory and on the decline. So from 43% down to 40%, and it's kind of middle of the road in our overall country rankings. I think that there's a couple things happening here. The first thing I think is media hasn't recovered from its reportage of 3/11. I think that by and large media was seen here on reporting on what perceived experts were saying about the issues and not really poking as aggressive holes in those statements and explanations as was expected. I also think there's a bit of an issue here with trying to define the business model for media going forward. I think there's a fundamental global redefinition of the business model of media that hasn't played out yet in Japan, and I think some of that is causing questions about the quality of the reporting, and we'll see that in a second when I break it down by specific media channels. So I think you've got two things going on there. Media hasn't recovered from questions around their 3/11 reporting, and also you've got changes in the business model of media, which is putting some pressure on resourcing of media in order to produce what I think is perceived as a quality product. Now, what's interesting for me here is we look at most trusted sources of information for news in Japan. Most trusted source of information for news in Japan, search engines. So I think that underlines kind of skepticism in the overall sample of opinion leaders. And now opinion leaders are saying, you know what? Instead of really trusting the traditional media as much as I have, in particular the morning newspapers, I'm really going to rely on things I can control. So I'm going to put in the search terms I'm looking for, nuclear power plus business plus government plus policy plus Tokyo election, whatever it may be, and see what comes up, and then I'm going to choose in rank order what comes up. So search engines at the top, followed by traditional media, followed by hybrid media, which are those media that are both online and in some kind of a traditional format. Owned media, which is .gov, so the government's website and web properties, as well as brands' owned properties, followed by least trusted social media, which I think is interesting given the nice bump social media had last year, in particular driven by Twitter for news and information about what had happened post 3/11. Now in the bottom three boxes, I'd call your attention to rank order of sources of information. So what's the first source that opinion leaders turn to for general information about business? Number 1, television. Number 2, newspapers. Number 3, search. This to me is a little bit interesting because traditionally Japan's been a heavy morning newspaper country, and that's where we've relied on initial news and information, in particular about business. I think as you go through some of your demographic shifts and have a high percentage or a high number of retirees entering the market, that you're actually probably seeing a little bit less usage. Subscriber base is probably staying the same in those morning newspapers, but in fact, we're not going there first. We're turning on the TV in the morning first. The second thing is, again, television coming up top for the first source that's being turned to for breaking news. And then what I like, again, to underscore the point on search engines is, what's the first source I turn to confirm information that I've picked up? And I'm going to search engines, again, something that I can control. As we look at, again, trends here in NGOs, NGOs are doing really well. Trust in NGOs on a global basis continues to go up. If you remember, NGOs, most trusted institution globally, least trusted in Japan. NGOs trust up in 17 out of the 26 countries that we measure. In Japan, statistically flat, but very low at 37%. In fact, if you look at that, lowest level of trust in NGOs out of any market globally that we measure. To carry on from there, let's just look at the trend in business. Japan in the middle there called out, doing very well. I'd say that's net neutral territory at 53%. Statistically even from last year. Trust in business up in 12 countries, down in 15. But because the trust in government globally has dropped so much, that gap in trust between business and government is the largest it's ever been in our global sample at 14 percentage points. Now I just want to kind of have a presentation sorbet here before I kind of jump into a little bit more detail on trust in business. So for context setting, business most trusted in Japan, followed by government, followed by media, followed by NGOs. There are four kind of, I think, what I would call environmental or contextual factors when we look at trust in business. The first one is the industry sector that the business operates in. The second one is the country of origin for that business. Is it from Japan or United States or Canada? The type of enterprise. Is it publicly traded? Is it privately held? And then finally, perceptions of leadership and efficacy of leadership of the business. So first, let's look at our sectors. For the first time in any market we've done this study in 14 years globally, technology is not the most trusted industry. So every market, every year for 14 years, technology the most trusted industry. In Japan, technology has been surpassed now by the automotive industry. I think there's a couple things happening here. The first thing I think is Toyota continues to sell more cars than anyone in the world. The second thing is I think automotive executives in your country have become much more visible. And I think that's been a response to quality issues from a few years past. Those executives and leadership teams have stayed, I think, kind of forward-looking and visible in talking about their products and services and backing those up. What I really think is happening here, however, is a nice nod to the automotive industry, but I would say some foreshadowing and a harbinger for the technology industry. And I'll substantiate this in a second, that I think the technology industry is poised for a big fall in trust driven by data privacy and security. In Japan, if 5 people have their information compromised, it's front page news. In the United States, we're dealing with issues related to Snowden and the Snowden leaks, which have also now floated into China, they've floated into Brazil, and floated into the markets of Western Europe. I think technology companies are going to be under real pressure to defend where they are on data privacy and security and where they've cooperated with governments without transparency to consumers, whether those are corporate consumers or individual consumers, about what they're doing on data privacy and security. So that's one industry where I think we're going to continue to see that decline, and I think Japan is probably the first market to start to show that weakness. In 12 months from now, I can come back and you can tell me I got it right or wrong. Now, if we start to break apart those sectors that have real trust issues, let's look at financial services. If you remember, overall trust, if we look at the fourth bar there in financial services industry in Japan, is at 42%. And what's really pulling that down is financial advisory and asset management. And you've had a lot of front page news over the last 12 months related to this. And in particular, you've got a lot of people going into retirement age where they have to depend on those pensions and the money they're pulling out of those assets. We want to be able to trust that they're secure. And we've got actually a financial advisor and asset manager on our panel tonight, and we're going to put her a little bit on the spot, I think. But we're welcoming you. The next thing that I would say is if we look at food and beverage industry, this is an industry that goes up and down every year depending on have we had a real scare, a real issue with food safety, or has obesity really entered into the national consciousness as a major health issue. And if you look at the least trusted sector within the industry, you see fast food restaurants in Japan, right down at the bottom at 37%. So I think there are probably some health issues percolating around obesity, as well as I know you've had a couple issues with food safety in the last 12 months. And finally, the energy industry to me is really interesting given your Tokyo elections coming up and given 311. This is interesting to me. First of all, we didn't call out nuclear, shame on us. But it's interesting to me to see the energy industry overall at 48%, but every subsector that we measured in Japan outperforms that, which essentially says you have hidden distrust in the nuclear industry here because we didn't ask the question. That's the hypothesis. Now, here's really good news for Japan. Again, if you think about business most trusted institution in Japan, then we actually asked the question across the board globally, how much do you trust companies headquartered in each one of these markets? So you see Japan, a really strong showing at 74% trust in Japanese companies, which I think is a real opportunity coupled with your economic success in the last 12 months, coupled with a reform agenda, and coupled with, I think, a global spotlight now turning back to Japan with feelings of optimism and hope. I think there's a real opportunity to capitalize on the trust in Japanese business overseas. And you can see companies headquartered in Germany being the most trusted, and not surprisingly, emerging market companies the least trusted. If you just look at the red bars on the far right. And I think that's driven by two things. The first thing is the lack of global brands from those emerging markets. And the second thing are questions around quality of products and services being produced and exported from those markets. Now, if we look at home, we say, okay, tell us how much you trust companies from Japan. So this is our Japan respondent list. Not surprisingly, you trust Japanese, or good, I would say, a note of optimism, that you trust Japanese companies the most out of any other country in the world, followed by Germany. And if you look all the way on the far right, you're not very happy with Korean companies or Chinese companies. And I think there's a bit of anomaly that Korea number's down, but if I just anecdotally look around the room at people carrying Samsung handphones, I think we've got maybe a more traditional country rivalry going on here as it relates to Korea, more so than a statement on the quality of products and services being produced by Korean companies. But I'd be happy to discuss that over beers this evening. Now, the next thing that I want to look at a little bit is that you see the performance by country of trust in Japanese businesses. So now I've said, okay, let's look at which countries trust Japanese business the most. And if you remember, on the far right, let's go there for a minute, South Korea trusts Japanese companies the least. And you trusted the South Korean companies second to the last. So you see a little bit of that rivalry. However, Indonesia loves you. That's FDI in my view, and high quality products. That's foreign direct investment going into Southeast Asia, plus high quality products. The UAE, again, Malaysia, another Southeast Asian nation. You see a lot of developing nations liking quality and perceived quality of products being produced here. And this is probably also reflects manufacturing investments from Japanese countries that are going into these markets as well. So I think you get two lifts: product quality and manufacturing in emerging markets. Now if we kind of look at business type, which is the third part of our context for trust in business. Again, Japan kind of bucks the trend here, which is family-owned businesses globally are the most trusted. And I'm happy to say I work for a family-owned business. I'm not happy to say my name's not on the front door of the family-owned business. But family-owned business is the most trusted globally. However, in Japan, you can see only 25 percentage point trust rating for family-owned businesses. In Japan, the most trusted business is actually big business. We like things that are big here. It says stability to us. It says predictable to us. So we like things that are big, that are solid, that are predictable. In particular, we like them when they're publicly traded. So we like big businesses that are publicly traded. We can see them. We can see how they're performing on a daily basis. We understand that they're going to be around, and they're really woven into the fabric of the nation. And if we look at just some of the things that we asked our respondents to rate when comparing publicly traded companies performing on this list of traits versus privately held companies performing these traits in Japan, you can see Privately held companies perform better on being entrepreneurial and being innovative. However, publicly traded companies outperform on responsiveness to customers' needs and on responsiveness to society's needs and on having transparency in their business practices and having top leadership, if I just pick off the top 5. So again, I think a lot of those are related to governance of the business and transparency of the business, as well as perceptions of big is good, it's more solid and more predictable to be here for the long term. Now, here's a kind of another interesting anomaly for me in the data, which is, if you remember, trust in business, most trusted institution, 52%. And it's been flat. It's recovered since its 2012 low. It's been flat. So whilst we trust business as an institution in Japan, we're really not so happy trusting the individuals that are the voice of business. So the most trusted spokesperson for business, if you look at the right-hand side here, the blue bars, the most trusted or the most highly rated spokesperson in terms of trust is a technical expert from within the company, so let's think white coat, and only 35% of our respondents trust that technical expert. So only 1 in 3 of our respondents trust a spokesperson on the business. That is frightening for business, for me. But I think it also says to me that business needs to think a little bit about where it can get some trust wins at its back. So what industry is it in? What country is it domiciled in? And how big is it? To start to think at what's going to start to drive a context to increase trust in our spokespeople. So I think you don't have any real good, solid, predictable spokesperson to be out in front on issues or opportunities consistently. So you trust the institution, you're not so sure about the individuals within the institution. And if you look at this historically, what you really see here is trust in spokespeople. Spokespeople failed you post 3/11. Because if you look at the 2011, you have relatively high levels of trust, in particular academics or experts on a company's industry or issue, topped out at 70%. You had a nosedive down post 3/11 and you've never recovered from that. So while we're generally optimistic about business, very optimistic in a trend line about government, we're not so sure about the individuals. We're not so sure we can trust the individual. We can trust the organization. It's big, it's solid, it's going to be around for the long term. Individual, we're not so certain about. And where this really jumps out at me in Japan is when you look at trust in business leaders and in government leaders on the following things. So how much do we trust business leaders to correct issues within industries that are experiencing problems? Only one out of 3 respondents trust a business leader to address an industry that has an ongoing issue. Less than 1 in 3 trust business leaders to make ethical and moral decisions. If I'm a business leader and respondents in this country don't trust me to make moral and ethical decisions, and they also don't trust me when I'm talking about my business, I'm a little bit worried. I'm going to have to find other people to talk for my business for me and talk with my business for me to build that trust in stakeholders on an ongoing basis. I'm not going to be able to do it on my own. And as bad as those numbers are for business, look at where they are for government. Only 17% of our respondents trust government to make ethical and moral decisions. I'm worried about that. So trust in government up 14 points, but we're still not so sure about the individuals. Institutional trust rebounding, individual trust not rebounding. Again, I just have this chart here to show you that you've got a real trust benefit for business over government, except in Japan, where you've kind of bucking that trend, although you do see business and government, as I said earlier, coming more closely together, which I do think gives in this country an opportunity for business as an institution and government as an institution to start to craft a joint narrative around ongoing development, progress, and sustainable development in the market. And if you look at kind of historical gaps here and the difference between trust in business and government, business always outperforms government here historically, or since I just show you kind of 6 years of data here. And again, you see the gap narrowing almost to its closest point, which, by the way, 2011, pre-March 11th, because the 2011 data was done in late 2010. So we're almost getting back to business and government running equal levels of trust, right around net neutral territory. So as we have this contextual thing of trust in business and trust in government in Japan narrowing, and not a clear mandate for either one to drive a public agenda, let's look a little bit about the relationship here. So while we do trust business more than government in Japan, our opinion leaders, they still want government to play an active role in regulating business. So we have more people wanting government to be more active in regulation versus fewer people. We have more people by a significant margin looking for government regulation in financial services industry. Again, think about those pensions and all the retirees going into tapping those assets. We have more people wanting, and the highest number, by the way, looking for government regulation of the energy industry. Not a surprise there. And the same thing on food and beverage. And if you really kind of pull that out and look at the underlying reasons here, what we're really looking for in government regulation of business is consumer protection. We're looking for health and safety. We're looking for making sure that governance is in place so consumers don't get ripped off, so people don't take off with your hard-earned cash and go to Thailand and buy a lot of houses. We're really looking for ways to protect the consumer, and we're seeing that responsibility being placed clearly in the hands of government, and a patriarchal expectation for government to take care of, quote, us, even amongst our opinion leaders. And in fact, we trust government so much to make those policies and to drive the debate that we would rather have government and technocrats driving that debate and writing those regulations than we would have business participating in them. And you see, in each one of these categories, the global respondents want more business participation in drafting of regulations, except in Japan, we want less than on the global level. So we've got a lot of trust in our regulators and our technocrats to draft, again, rules and regulations that are protecting consumers. And if I just kind of look again about building trust a little bit, there are 5 factors in building trust. There are 16 overall behaviors. There are 5 big factors in building trust. The least important of these factors is operations. That means returns for shareholders, level of performance of management. So that's the least important, which means it's table stakes. If you don't have trust in operations, you cannot go up and increase your trust with stakeholders about the rest of your business. So least important operations, followed by purpose. So that you have a pursuit in your business that transcends profits. The third driver is products and services, that you have high quality products and services priced at a point where your customer can derive value. The second most important is integrity. And the most important is engagement. How actively your business is engaging with stakeholders critical to your success, and how transparent you are in doing that. And if you kind of look at this chart, I just ask you to look at the top 6 here. If you look at the green and the blue, you really get the essence of what we're talking about. The green falls into the ethical bucket. The blue falls into the engagement bucket. So the 6 most important drivers of trust in business here are acts responsibly in a crisis, so that's directly related back to 311, is transparent and open, has high quality products and services, which always comes up right around 3rd or 4th in these surveys. Then on the engagement level, you listen to customers, you look after your employees, and you communicate often about your business. So you're actively engaged with stakeholders critical to your success. You're doing it that way, which doesn't only comply with the law, but it exceeds expectations on transparency, and it delivers on governance expectations. Now, I talked a little bit about my fears of technology and technology really being knocked off the perch here. If you remember, automotive has displaced technology as the most trusted industry in Japan. And if you start to look in at what's driving some expectations, we've got some consumer data here for Japanese stakeholders where behaviors that are important to driving trust. Number 1, protects customer data. So if you look at protects customer data, you look at a decrease of trust in technology, I start to worry again and think that Japan might be on the front end here of telling us that technology companies and technology as an industry has an issue. Now we look specifically to CEOs, and remember, trust in spokespeople in business is low. CEOs were in the bottom half of those trust ratings. If CEOs want to build trust, they have to be front and center during challenging times. We had a bit of a fail there. They have to communicate clearly and transparently. Clearly a fail there if you think of overall levels of trust in spokespeople again. And they have to tell the truth regardless of how complex or unpopular it is. So we just start thinking about that and then think about engagement and think about getting out in front of issues instead of addressing reputational issues. We start to see, I think, a bit of a recipe here for managing trust, which gives us, government and business, an opportunity to drive a forward-looking agenda. And I'd say last point I want to make here is I think there are three kind of key elements to driving institutional trust here. The first thing is to actually participate in the dialogue, not to sit back and wait for things to happen and then explain what's happened or why it happened, but to actually start to listen to and engage key stakeholders on areas of interest to them and to you. The second thing is to start to advocate a very clear point of view, that your business not only pushes your business forward, but starts to advocate points of view that are important for your business operations as well as important for the stakeholders that you rely on in those business operations. And third, and also important, is evaluate how you're performing against those expectations, evaluate how your stakeholders feel you're performing against their participation expectations, and report back on those things regularly and transparently. And now I'd like to thank you for your attention and hand it over to our MC and then get going with the panel. So thank you very much.